She thought she had control. For years, Victoria Langley ruled the first-class cabin with quiet authority. She decided who was served first, who received warmth, and who was dismissed without a second thought. Her power was subtle, unspoken but absolute. Until one flight. Until one request for a simple glass of water. Until the moment she looked into the eyes of Elijah Carter and made the wrong choice, the choice that would end her career forever. By the time the plane landed, she wouldn't just be serving drinks. She'd be facing a reckoning she never saw coming. Will she walk away with her reputation intact? Or will she become the lesson that echoes across the industry? Before we dive in, comment below where in the world you're watching from. If you love gripping stories that reveal hidden power, injustice, and shocking consequences, don't forget to like and subscribe so you never miss a new one. Now, let's begin. The air inside the first-class cabin was hushed, thick with the kind of silence that money buys. The kind that comes not from a lack of sound, but from the careful, practiced restraint of those who believe they are in a world apart from the one they left behind at the gate. Elijah and Miriam Carter stepped onto the plane with the ease of those who had traveled extensively, but also with the quiet awareness of people who had spent a lifetime understanding when they were being watched. Elijah walked first, his shoulders squared, his dark gray suit crisp, perfectly pressed, his salt and pepper beard was neatly trimmed. His movements measured every step, carrying the dignity of a man who had learned long ago that any sign of discomfort would be interpreted as weakness. Behind him, Miriam followed, her lavender dress flowing gently as she moved, her pearl earrings catching the cabin light. She was the picture of poise, of a woman who had long mastered the delicate balance between warmth and distance. And yet, as they walked down the aisle toward their seats, something invisible moved with them. A whisper of hesitation in the glances of a few seated passengers. A flicker of uncertainty in the eyes of the flight crew. It was brief, just a moment. Just a breath, but it was there. The kind of pause that people like Elijah and Miriam Carter had learned to recognize all too well. They didn't speak of it. Not now. Not here. Their seats were near the front 2A and 2B. Elijah reached up to place their carry-on bags in the overhead compartment. His movements unhurried. Miriam exhaled as she settled into her seat, her fingers brushing over the armrest, her breath steady but shallow. The long travel day had taken its toll. Elijah pressed the call button. A moment passed, then another, and then she arrived, Victoria Langley, the lead flight attendant for first class. She was tall, poised, her blonde hair pinned into the kind of perfect twist that suggested control. Precision. Her uniform was immaculate. Her name tag positioned just so. She had been in this job long enough to know how to move through the space like she belonged in it. Long enough to decide, in an instant, who else belonged here, and who did not. She stood before them, arms crossed loosely, chin lifted ever so slightly. Yes? Elijah smiled, a small but deliberate act. Could we have a glass of water? My wife isn't feeling well. The pause was so slight, so imperceptible, that most wouldn't have noticed. But Elijah did, so did Miriam. Victoria's expression remained neutral, but there was something behind her eyes. Something unreadable yet undeniable. Water will be served with the meal service, she said, her voice clipped. Matter of fact, we have a schedule. Elijah tilted his head just slightly. I understand, but she just needs a small sip. His voice was steady, polite. There was no urgency in his request. No demand, just the simple expectation of courtesy. Victoria's lips pressed into a thin line. A sigh, so quiet it barely existed. Sir, she said, a hint of something colder slipping into her voice now. If I start making exceptions, then other passengers will ask for the same. Something inside the cabin shifted, like a current changing direction beneath the surface. A few nearby passengers turned their heads slightly, their ears tuning in. Celia Monroe, a younger flight attendant standing near the galley, stiffened. She had seen this before, not this exact moment, not these exact words, but the rhythm of it. The silent calculation in Victoria's face, the unspoken message beneath her refusal. Elijah studied her for a beat longer, and then, without anger, without resistance, he gave a single, measured nod. Of course, he said, his voice even. Miriam reached for his hand, squeezing it gently. It's fine, love, she murmured. Victoria said nothing more. She turned on her heel and disappeared down the aisle, her posture tall, unwavering. To her, The matter was settled, a simple request denied, an unnecessary disruption handled. But the moment was not over. Not for Elijah, not for Miriam, not for the people who had been watching. Celia remained frozen in place near the galley, her hands clenching at her sides. A man in 1C, middle-aged, sharp suit, expensive watch, lifted his head briefly from his tablet and gestured lazily toward Victoria as she passed. "Just water, please." Without hesitation, without a second thought, Victoria nodded. "Of course, sir." She poured the water, ice cubes clinking softly, and placed it down on the tray table with a practiced ease. She even added a napkin, a small touch of courtesy. Elijah Carter didn't move, didn't speak, didn't shift in his seat. But Miriam did. She opened her eyes, the exhaustion in them replaced by something quieter, something colder. She had seen it too. Elijah exhaled slowly, lifting his phone from the tray table. His fingers moved with the same measured patience he carried in everything he did. He typed a short message, pressed send, and set the phone down again, lacing his fingers together. Miriam's voice was barely above a whisper. "Are you sure you want to handle it this way?" Elijah smiled faintly. "She'll learn soon enough." Across the cabin, Celia's pulse quickened, because something was happening, something small, something that no one could see. Not yet. Victoria Langley moved through the first-class cabin with the air of someone who belonged. Her smile, polite, practiced, flashed easily as she refilled glasses of champagne, adjusted napkins with effortless grace, exchanged small pleasantries with the kind of passengers she had come to expect in this space. She had already forgotten about the Carters. To her, it had been a momentary interaction, no different than a dozen others she had handled throughout her career. She had learned long ago how to diffuse, how to shut down requests before they became demands. And yet, something lingered in the air. Not a confrontation, not open rebellion, just the quiet knowledge that the wrong people had been paying attention. Celia Monroe felt it. She stood near the galley, her fingers tapping restlessly against the counter, her eyes flicking toward Victoria as she moved between the rows. The younger flight attendant had been in first-class service long enough to notice when something was off. And something was off. It wasn't the refusal itself. Rules could be bent all the time. But they weren't bent for everyone. They were bent for those who fit the unspoken mold. The ones who stepped onto the plane and were greeted with warmth before they even sat down. She had seen it before, in ways so small they were easy to ignore. The businessman in the tailored suit who was offered a drink before he asked. The young couple who spoke too loudly, dressed too casually, and were met with thin-lipped smiles and stiff politeness. The way a request became an inconvenience when it came from the wrong person. She had watched Victoria deny Elijah Carter a simple glass of water. And she had watched her pour one without hesitation for the man in 1C. Celia shifted, her fingers curling into her palms. "Victoria," she said quietly. Victoria turned, one brow arching slightly, as if she already knew what Celia was going to say. Celia hesitated, lowering her voice further. "That couple in 2A and 2B, was it really necessary to refuse them water?" Victoria's smile tightened at the edges. "Celia," she said, her voice smooth, controlled, "we have service protocols for a reason." "But," Victoria exhaled sharply, stepping closer. "Listen to me," she murmured, keeping her tone low. "If you want to last in first class, you need to stop second-guessing how things are done." Celia clenched her jaw. "How things are done?" Victoria turned back toward the aisle, her posture impeccable, her authority unquestioned. Celia, left standing in the galley, swallowed down the words she wanted to say. She wasn't supposed to question it. But she had seen the way Elijah Carter had looked at Victoria after that water was served to someone else. It was not anger. It was something more dangerous. It was patience. Elijah sat calmly in his seat, fingers tapping lightly against the armrest. His phone rested on the tray table, the screen dark now. Whatever message he had sent, it had been received. Miriam exhaled, the tension in her body barely visible except to those who knew her well. She didn't look toward Victoria. She didn't look at the man in 1C. She didn't need to. She had spent her entire life learning not to react. Elijah leaned in slightly, his voice meant only for her. "Do you remember?" he murmured. "The hotel in Chicago?" Miriam's fingers twitched. She did not answer right away. She remembered. The way the concierge had smiled through his teeth as he explained that the hotel was fully booked. Despite their confirmed reservation, the way the lobby had filled with the heavy, unbearable silence that comes when people see something unjust and choose to do nothing. And she remembered what happened when the manager realized the name on the reservation. The sudden shift, the urgent apologies, the desperate, scrambling attempts to make it right. Why? She had asked Elijah. Later that evening, as they sipped from the bottle of wine the manager had sent up as an apology. Why didn't you call them out? Elijah had only smiled, slow and knowing, because I didn't have to. It was a quiet kind of power. One that people like Victoria never anticipated. Because she had never stopped to ask for their last name. Victoria continued about her duties. The earlier exchange already fading from her mind. But then, a sharp chime from the overhead system. A voice, calm and professional. Miss Langley, please report to the cockpit. For a brief second, everything stood still. Celia's heart skipped. Victoria straightened, adjusting her uniform, before heading toward the front of the plane. Passengers noticed. They always noticed. The shift in energy. The unspoken change in atmosphere. Victoria disappeared through the cockpit door. Inside, Captain Robert Jensen turned in his seat. His face unreadable. Miss Langley, he said, his tone neutral, but firm. We received a priority communication regarding your service in first class. Victoria blinked. Sir? The in-flight phone on the control panel was still active. A call connected to the airline's corporate office. A voice came through, deep and level. Miss Langley, do you know who is seated in 2A and 2B? Victoria frowned. No, sir. The pause stretched longer than it should have. Then the voice spoke again. Elijah and Miriam Carter. The name should have meant nothing. But the way the captain's expression remained rigid, how his hands tightened over the controls, told her otherwise. The voice on the line continued. They own this airline. Victoria's stomach dropped. Cold, sharp, immediate. She had dismissed the owners of the airline. She had refused them service. She had assumed. And now, her assumption had caught up with her. You will correct your mistake. The voice continued, no longer neutral, but ice cold. And upon landing, you will report directly to the executive boardroom for review. Victoria swallowed hard, her throat suddenly dry. Yes, sir, she managed. The call disconnected. Captain Jensen studied her for a moment longer before turning back to the controls. You'd better get back to work, he said. Victoria turned stiffly and walked out of the cockpit. And for the first time in her entire career, she was afraid. Celia watched as Victoria emerged. Her face pale, her posture suddenly too rigid. She walked past the galley without saying a word. Then she stopped, just short of 2A and 2B. And for the first time she looked at them. Truly looked. Elijah sat comfortably, hands folded, gaze calm but expectant. Miriam sat beside him, fingers lightly resting on her lap. Her expression unreadable. They weren't angry. They weren't demanding anything. They were just waiting. Victoria cleared her throat and crouched slightly, bringing herself to their level. Mr. and Mrs. Carter, she said, her words measured, careful. There was a misunderstanding earlier. I'd like to offer you some refreshments. Elijah turned his head slowly, his eyes locking onto hers. A misunderstanding, he repeated. Victoria nodded quickly, forcing a smile. Yes, you didn't realize, Elijah murmured, his voice quiet but cutting, that we were important. Victoria's face burned. No, sir, that's not. You didn't ask anyone else for their ticket, Miriam said, her voice deceptively gentle. You didn't hesitate to serve other passengers. Just us. Victoria's mouth opened, but there was nothing to say. A few passengers nearby had turned their heads slightly, pretending not to listen but very clearly paying attention. Elijah leaned forward just a bit. Tell me, Miss Langley, he asked, his voice dangerously soft. Why did you assume we didn't belong? Victoria's breath caught. Because there was no right answer. And there never had been. The tension in the cabin was no longer subtle. It was in the air, thick like humidity before a thunderstorm, clinging to the skin of those who could feel it. A shift had occurred, something unspoken but undeniable, the kind of shift that made people uneasy without knowing why. That made them sit up a little straighter, glance toward the front of the cabin just a second too long before turning away. Victoria Langley had felt it the moment she left the cockpit. She had felt it when she crouched beside Elijah Carter, When he looked at her not with anger, but with something worse, expectation. Expectation that she would answer the one question that had no right answer. Why did you assume we didn't belong? Victoria had built her entire career on control. The ability to navigate any situation. To smooth over conflict before it ever had a chance to take shape. But now, sitting before her was a man who knew control better than she ever could. Because control was not about who spoke the loudest. It was about who waited. Elijah Carter had not raised his voice. He had not demanded compensation or threatened to file a complaint. He was waiting. Waiting for her to flounder. Waiting for her to realize she had already lost. And now, the moment stretched between them like a knife's edge. Victoria's lips parted, the words forming in her throat before she even knew what they were. Some excuse. Some vague attempt at salvaging what was left of her position in this space. But before she could speak, a voice. Excuse me. The words sliced through the silence. Smooth, controlled. A woman in the first row. Mid-50s. Tailored blazer. The type of passenger Victoria usually felt at ease with. Victoria turned, desperate for the distraction, for an escape from Elijah Carter's steady, patient gaze. The woman folded her hands on the armrest. Her expression polite, but pointed. I was just wondering, when exactly did the rules change about when water can be served? Victoria's stomach flipped. She forced a smile, one that didn't quite reach her eyes. I am sorry? The woman tilted her head slightly, like she was trying to piece together a puzzle she already knew the answer to. Because I heard what you told them earlier. That water is only served with the meal service. She gestured toward the businessman in 1C. But then I saw you serve him water a few minutes later. Victoria felt her pulse hammering against her ribs. This was spiraling too fast. She needed to regain control. She straightened, clasping her hands in front of her. I apologize if there was any confusion. The woman held up a hand, stopping her mid-sentence. I'm not confused. More heads were turning now. More passengers pretending not to listen while clearly tuning in. The woman smiled, but there was no warmth behind it. I just want to understand the policy. She continued, her voice calm, almost conversational, since it seems to change depending on who's asking. Victoria's breath caught in her throat. Celia Monroe was watching from the galley now. Her arms crossed, her expression unreadable. Victoria knew she had seconds before this turned into something she could not contain. She needed to move. She turned quickly, her heels clicking against the polished floor as she fled toward the galley. But the moment she stepped inside, she saw Celia reaching for the in-flight phone. And the pit in her stomach deepened. The phone barely rang before it was answered. Victoria's hands curled into fists at her sides as she stood frozen in place. Listening. Yes, sir, Celia said, her voice steady. A pause. Then she turned, meeting Victoria's gaze before offering the receiver. It's for you. Victoria hesitated. Her throat was dry as she reached for the phone, pressing it to her ear. This is Victoria Langley. A voice, clipped and direct. Miss Langley, this is Dominic Carter, head of cabin crew operations. Victoria felt the floor shift beneath her. I assume you already understand why I'm calling. He continued. She swallowed. Sir, you are to remain on board after landing. You will be escorted to the executive office for disciplinary review. Her breath hitched. The moment had already spun beyond her control. Faster than she could grasp. She opened her mouth to explain, to defend herself, but the voice on the other end cut her off. Mr. Carter has personally requested that this matter be reviewed at the highest level. Victoria's knees locked, because suddenly, she understood. This wasn't just about an interaction gone wrong. This wasn't about a mistake that could be excused with an apology. This was about a name. Elijah Carter. A name that, had she bothered to ask, would have changed the entire outcome of this flight. A name that carried weight. Power, the kind of power that did not demand, but expected. And now, the weight of it was pressing down on her. Suffocating. The call ended with a sharp click. Victoria lowered the phone slowly. Her hands trembled. Celia was still watching. And now, Victoria realized so was the entire cabin. Passengers had noticed her return. They had seen her expression, her stiff posture, the way her hands clenched at her sides. They knew. A low murmur spread through first class. A ripple that started at the front and worked its way back. A shift that Victoria could no longer stop. No longer silence. Because something had happened that no amount of corporate training could prepare her for. She had spent years making choices. Quiet ones, small ones. Deciding who deserved warmth. Deciding who could be dismissed. Deciding who mattered. And now, for the first time she had been dismissed. The rules had not changed. They had simply been turned against her. And Victoria Langley was beginning to understand. There was no way out. Not anymore. Victoria Langley had always prided herself on composure. No matter the turbulence. No matter the entitled passengers. No matter the endless demands of first-class service. She had remained unshaken. It was a skill honed over years. A carefully constructed mask of control. But now, standing in the galley, her grip tight around the phone, she felt something she hadn't in a long time. Panic. The call had been brief. But its weight sat heavy in her chest. She was no longer just a flight attendant managing an uncomfortable exchange. She was no longer just a senior crew member enforcing the rules of first class. She was now under review. By the time the plane landed, she wouldn't be the one setting the terms. She wouldn't be the one deciding what happened next. And the worst part? Everyone knew. Passengers in first class were still watching, their eyes darting toward her. Some subtle, some blatant. They weren't just hearing whispers anymore. They were seeing it unfold in real time. Victoria forced a slow breath, willing her hands to stop shaking. She needed to salvage this. She had to. Victoria stepped out of the galley, her face carefully neutral, her posture as poised as ever. She moved through the first-class cabin with calculated grace, her hands smoothing the folds of her uniform as if she could press this moment back into order. And then she stopped, because Elijah Carter was still there, still seated, still watching, his expression unreadable. Miriam, beside him, turned the page of her magazine as if this was any other flight. As if the tension curling around Victoria's throat was nothing more than background noise. Victoria swallowed hard and took a careful step forward. She crouched slightly, lowering herself to their level, an attempt at humility. At control. Mr. and Mrs. Carter, she began, her voice softer now, polished. I want to personally apologize if there was any misunderstanding earlier. Elijah Carter tilted his head. Just slightly. A misunderstanding, he repeated, voice calm, measured. Victoria nodded quickly. Yes, Miriam finally looked up. You didn't realize. It was not a question. It was a statement. Victoria opened her mouth, but the words dried on her tongue. Elijah leaned forward slightly, resting his elbows on the armrest. You didn't realize we were important, he said, his voice still gentle, still patient. That's what you meant to say, isn't it? Victoria felt the blood rush to her cheeks. No, sir, you didn't ask anyone else for their tickets. Miriam continued, her voice steady, deceptively mild. You didn't hesitate to serve the other passengers. Just us. Victoria's mouth went dry. Around her, the quiet hum of the cabin had changed. Passengers were listening, not even pretending not to. Anymore. Elijah studied her for a long moment before asking, so simply, so unbearably softly, tell me, Miss Langley, what made you so sure we didn't belong? A chill crept up Victoria's spine. Because there it was. The question she had been avoiding. The question that had no right answer. Because if she denied it, she would be lying. And if she admitted it, she would be ruined. A sharp buzz from the intercom shattered the silence. Cabin crew, prepare for initial descent. A routine announcement. But in this moment, it was something else. It was a countdown. A signal that there were only minutes left in the air before reality would come crashing down. Victoria forced a stiff smile, nodding as if the conversation had come to a natural close. Of course, sir, I understand, she murmured before standing, before turning quickly toward the galley, before escaping. But the moment she stepped inside, Celia Monroe was already there, already watching. The younger flight attendant leaned against the counter, arms crossed. You okay? She asked, voice careful. Victoria inhaled sharply, ignoring the question, pretending she hadn't heard the quiet edge of knowing in Celia's tone. Instead, she reached for a tray of drinks, her hands unsteady as she adjusted the glasses. Celia didn't move. Victoria, she tried again, this time softer, more insistent. Do you understand what's happening? Victoria turned sharply. I don't want to talk about this. But Celia shook her head. her voice dropping lower. You keep acting like this is just a bad passenger interaction. Like it's going to go away when we land. Victoria's jaw tightened. Celia exhaled, watching her carefully. You embarrassed them, she said, voice even. And now, people are realizing it. Victoria's pulse pounded. Celia leaned in slightly, lowering her voice even further. You might think this is just between you and them, she murmured, but passengers are watching you. And they're talking. Victoria clenched her jaw. I don't need your opinion, Celia, she snapped. But Celia didn't back down. She tilted her head, her expression unreadable. I'm not giving you my opinion, she said. I'm giving you a warning. And with that, she stepped away, leaving Victoria alone. Alone with the weight of what she had done. Alone with the knowledge that her control over this flight over anything was slipping further and further out of reach. The plane tilted slightly, beginning its slow, careful descent. Victoria stood frozen in the galley, gripping the counter so tightly her knuckles turned white. She could hear the rustling of passengers adjusting their seats, the quiet murmur of conversation. And then, another sound, a sharp chime, the in-flight phone. Victoria's stomach twisted. She knew who it would be before she even reached for the receiver. She lifted it with a shaky hand, pressing it to her ear. This is Victoria Langley. A deep, steady voice spoke on the other end. Miss Langley, this is James Caldwell, Vice President of Operations. Victoria's breath hitched. I want you to listen very carefully. Caldwell continued, his tone calm, unwavering. Upon landing, you will remain on board. Security will escort you to the executive office. Victoria's fingers curled around the receiver. You are being placed on immediate suspension, pending further investigation. The words struck like a physical blow. Victoria's throat tightened. Sir, please, Caldwell cut her off. This is not a negotiation. Miss Langley. Silence. Then, one final blow. Mr. Carter has personally requested that this matter be reviewed at the highest level. Victoria felt her chest constrict. Because now she understood. This wasn't just a disciplinary review. This wasn't just about her. This was about change. She had spent years deciding who belonged. But today, she had chosen the wrong people to dismiss. And now, the rules had finally changed. Not for them. For her. The plane began its descent. The gentle hum of the engines shifting as the cabin tilted slightly forward. For most passengers, this was a routine moment, a signal to check seatbelts, to gather scattered belongings, to prepare for the familiar jolt of wheels touching tarmac. But for Victoria Langley, it was the start of something far less certain. The countdown to a reckoning. She stood in the galley, the in-flight phone still warm in her trembling hand. The words of James Caldwell, Vice President of Operations, echoed in her mind. Upon landing, you will remain on board. Security will escort you. She swallowed hard, the lump in her throat refusing to budge. A million thoughts crashed over her at once. How did it get to this point? How did a simple refusal escalate into a disciplinary review involving the owners of the airline? She'd handled countless passengers, navigated dozens of conflicts with grace, and always managed to stay in control. But now, control was slipping through her fingers like sand. And the one thing she'd never considered, the silent judgments she made every day. The decisions that seemed so innocuous was suddenly glaring back at her, exposing a truth she hadn't wanted to confront. Across the cabin, Elijah Carter sat with a quiet stillness. He didn't look triumphant or vengeful. He didn't even look angry. He was simply watching, his eyes reflecting a patient, practiced disappointment that cut deeper than any raised voice could. Miriam, beside him, turned a page of her magazine. Her expression was calm, unreadable, but her presence spoke volumes. It was the way she carried herself. The quiet dignity that never wavered even when they were refused something as simple as a glass of water. Victoria turned away, the weight of their gaze pressing heavy on her back. She tried to steady her breath, tried to regain the composure she'd prided herself on for so long. But as the plane continued its descent, the atmosphere in first class grew taut. The murmurs of passengers an uneasy undercurrent. Then, suddenly a voice, clear, steady, and cutting through the tension. "Excuse me," said the woman in 1B, the one who had questioned Victoria earlier about the water service. Her tone was polite, but her eyes were sharp, perceptive. "I couldn't help but notice the commotion earlier. Is everything all right?" Victoria stiffened. She forced a tight smile, her voice betraying none of the turmoil churning inside her. "Yes, ma'am, everything is under control." But the woman's gaze lingered, her curiosity unabated. "It didn't seem that way. It's unusual, isn't it, for the head of operations to be involved in something like this?" Victoria's pulse quickened. Passengers nearby were now openly listening, their heads turned slightly, their attention focused. The quiet hum of conversation had ceased, replaced by a charged silence. Before Victoria could respond, Elijah Carter spoke, his voice low but firm. "Perhaps it's not as unusual as it should be." His words hung in the air, heavy with implication. Victoria felt her breath catch in her throat. The subtext clear. It wasn't just about water. It wasn't about service protocols. It was about something far deeper, something that had been simmering beneath the surface of polite interactions and forced smiles. The woman in 1B raised an eyebrow. "I see," she said, her tone laced with knowing. "Sometimes, it's not about what's said, but what's left unsaid." Murmurs rippled through the cabin, passengers shifting uncomfortably in their seats. Victoria's mind raced, desperate to regain control of the narrative spiraling out of her grasp. "I assure you, ma'am, our policies are consistent," Victoria managed, her voice strained. "There was a misunderstanding, but it's being handled internally." "Internally?" the woman repeated, her tone cool. "And what does that mean for the passengers who experience the inconsistencies?" Victoria bristled, but before she could answer, Elijah leaned forward slightly, his eyes locking onto hers with a quiet intensity. "It means," he said, "that accountability only comes when the right people are watching." The statement was simple, but it struck a nerve because it was true. In a system built on silent hierarchies and unspoken biases, who got served and who got ignored often depended on who was paying attention. And for once, the tables had turned. Victoria wasn't the one with the power to decide who mattered. The intercom crackled, the captain's voice cutting through the tension. "Ladies and gentlemen, we are beginning our final approach. Please ensure your seat belts are fastened and all carry-on items are stowed." The cabin adjusted, passengers shifting in their seats, the momentarily broken rhythm giving Victoria a small reprieve. But it was short-lived. As the plane descended, the awareness of what awaited her upon landing loomed larger. The knowledge that she would be escorted off the plane not as the senior flight attendant she had always been, but as someone under scrutiny. Someone whose judgment had been questioned at the highest levels. The descent was smooth, the runway coming into view as the plane dipped lower. But inside Victoria, everything felt like it was spiraling out of control. Her breath came in shallow, uneven bursts. She pressed her trembling hands to her sides, willing herself to stay composed. But the weight of what she had done, of what she hadn't done, was suffocating. For years, she had moved through first class with a sense of authority, quietly deciding who deserved her attention, her courtesy. But now, in this moment of reckoning, she was forced to confront the unspoken biases that had guided those choices. Choices that seemed so small at the time, but that had always been noticed by the people she chose to dismiss. And as the plane touched down, the wheels skidding softly against the tarmac, Victoria realized that the impact of her decisions would echo far beyond this flight. Because the truth, unspoken but undeniable, was that power wasn't just about who gave orders. It was about who listened. The plane rolled to a stop, the familiar chime signaling the end of the journey. But for Victoria, it was only the beginning. The cabin doors opened, the usual hustle of disembarking passengers filling the air. But her eyes remained fixed on the front, where two uniformed security officers stood waiting. She knew what came next. And for the first time, she wasn't in control. She had always believed that respect was earned by asserting authority. But now, as she faced the quiet judgment of those she had overlooked, she understood respect could just as easily be lost by forgetting the humanity of those who asked for something as simple as a glass of water. With a steadying breath, she rose from her seat. The silent storm she had ignored for so long was now impossible to avoid. And it was time to face the consequences. The plane had landed. The engines had softened into a low hum. The final echoes of a journey that was, for most, already over. Passengers stretched, reaching for their carry-ons, murmuring goodbyes to seatmates they would never see again. Some yawned, already thinking of their next destination. For them, this was just another flight. For Victoria Langley, it was the end of something far greater. She remained frozen in the galley, her hands gripping the counter as if letting go would send her tumbling into the abyss. She could hear the rustling of coats being slipped on, the clipped voices of businessmen making last-minute confirmations into their phones, the shuffle of heels on the carpet. And beyond all that, just past the threshold of the open cabin door, stood 2 uniformed security officers. Waiting. She could not see them from here, but she knew they were there. She knew because the murmurs had already begun. Passengers stealing glances toward the front, nudging each other, whispering just loud enough to be heard. Some wore careful expressions of curiosity. Others, thinly disguised amusement. The thrill of witnessing something out of the ordinary. Being able to recount a story over dinner. Did you hear? A flight attendant was escorted off the plane today. No idea why. Must have done something bad. The weight of those unspoken narratives pressed down on Victoria. She straightened her uniform, smoothing invisible wrinkles from the fabric. It was a useless gesture. Her authority, her poise, everything she had built was already unraveling. And still, she hesitated. She stepped out of the galley with measured movements, willing her breath to stay steady. As she walked down the aisle, time stretched unnaturally, each second drawing out longer than the last. Passengers watched, not all of them openly. Some were discreet, their gazes flicking up only briefly before turning away. But others didn't bother with subtlety. They turned in their seats, their eyes tracking her every step. The businessman in 1C, who had been served water without question, met her gaze for half a second before looking back at his tablet. Uninterested, the woman in 1B, the one who had questioned her about the changing rules, watched her carefully, as if waiting to see whether Victoria would hold her head high or crumble beneath the weight of what was happening. And then, there were the Carters. Elijah Carter sat back in his seat, his fingers interlocked in his lap, his expression unreadable. Miriam Carter took a delicate sip from a glass of water, one she had received from another flight attendant after Victoria's refusal. The ice clinked softly against the sides. A quiet sound, yet somehow louder than anything else in the cabin. Victoria didn't know if they would look at her. She didn't know if she wanted them to. But at the last moment, just as she passed their row, Elijah lifted his gaze. And this time, he held it. It wasn't an act of cruelty. There was no anger, no pleasure in her downfall. Just the same quiet, unwavering presence he had carried since the beginning. The same patience that had let this moment unfold exactly as he knew it would. He had never needed to raise his voice. Never needed to demand. Because power, the kind that lasts, the kind that changes things, does not come from volume. It comes from the weight of truth, pressing down, reshaping the world in its own image. Victoria tore her eyes away. She kept walking. She had no other choice. The security officers were waiting at the entrance of the plane, their expressions neutral, professional. One of them, a tall man with a closely shaven head, gave a small nod. Miss Langley? Victoria hesitated. She had always walked through airports with confidence, with the quiet authority that came from knowing she was the one enforcing the rules. Now, for the first time, she was the one being escorted. Her mouth felt dry. She nodded, unable to find her voice. The officer stepped aside, gesturing toward the jet bridge. Passengers were still watching. Some of them would tell this story later, how they had seen a flight attendant led away by security. How they had felt something shift in the air of first class that day. Victoria straightened her back and stepped forward, one foot in front of the other. The door of the aircraft closed behind her with a soft but final click. The artificial chill of the airport air hit her like a slap. The noise of the terminal muffled voices. The distant hum of rolling suitcases. The sterile announcements echoing through the halls felt strangely distant. She walked between the security officers, her heels clicking against the linoleum floor. The path was painfully familiar. One she had taken hundreds of times before after landing. But this time, she was not walking toward another assignment. She was walking toward judgment. The doors ahead slid open, revealing the terminal in its full, indifferent vastness. And standing just beyond security clearance, waiting for her, were 2 men in dark suits. James Caldwell, Vice President of Operations. Dominic Carter, Head of Cabin Crew Operations. Their presence confirmed what Victoria already knew. This was not just a routine disciplinary meeting. This was an event, a statement. Passengers passed by, some glancing at the gathered executives before continuing toward their gates. Some of them wouldn't remember this moment at all. But others would sense the significance of it. Victoria slowed her pace. For a fleeting second, she wanted to turn back. To undo the moment. To insist that none of this was necessary. That it had all been a misunderstanding. That she had simply been following protocol. But deep down, she knew. This was never just about a glass of water. It had never been about what she had done. It had always been about who she had done it to. And that was the difference. That was what made this moment impossible to escape. She took the final steps toward the men waiting for her. James Caldwell's expression was unreadable. But there was a certain finality in his stance. Dominic Carter barely looked at her before checking his watch. Then, Caldwell finally spoke. "Miss Langley," he said, his voice calm but firm. "Let's talk." Victoria clenched her fists, her nails digging into her palms. There was no way out now. She exhaled, straightened her back, and stepped forward. And with that, the doors behind her slid shut. Her past choices locked inside an airplane she no longer had the privilege of stepping onto. The executive boardroom was colder than she expected. Not the temperature, no. The air was still, heavy, the kind of silence that comes not from emptiness but from presence. A silence that demanded something from her before she had even sat down. Victoria Langley had always believed she understood power. She had learned to wield it in small, imperceptible ways. A glance that decided which passengers would be attended to first. A clipped tone that let someone know they were asking for too much. A carefully timed smile to soften the edges of rejection. She had spent years in control. Now, she sat in the very room where control was taken away. Across from her, James Caldwell, Vice President of Operations, and Dominic Carter, Head of Cabin Crew, sat side by side. Their faces were unreadable, their hands folded neatly on the polished table. Behind them, a wall of floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked the tarmac. Planes gliding soundlessly across the runway, oblivious to the weight pressing down on her shoulders. And at the head of the table, the man she had tried to dismiss. Elijah Carter. He had not spoken yet. Had barely even moved. He sat with the quiet patience of someone who had seen this before. Who had watched this scene unfold time and time again with different players. Different faces, but always the same script. The only difference was that now, Victoria was the one in the seat across from him. She had spent her entire career deciding who mattered. Now, she was waiting to see if she did. Caldwell cleared his throat, breaking the silence. "Miss Langley," he began, his voice cool, professional. "I trust you understand why we're here." Victoria sat rigid, her hands pressed against her lap to keep them from trembling. "Yes, sir." Caldwell nodded, as if that was enough. "This is a formal review of your conduct during Flight 237. We have received a direct request from Mr. Carter to assess the situation at the highest level." He gestured slightly toward Elijah, as if she needed reminding. Victoria forced herself to nod, though her throat felt tight. Caldwell glanced down at a thin folder in front of him, flipping it open with precise, deliberate movements. "The issue, as I see it," he continued, "is not merely the refusal of a passenger request, but the pattern of selective service that has been observed in your interactions." Victoria's heart pounded. He wasn't just talking about this flight. This was bigger. Caldwell turned the page, skimming something before lifting his gaze back to her. "Before we move forward, Miss Langley, we'd like to give you the opportunity to explain your actions." He leaned back slightly, waiting. So did Dominic Carter. So did Elijah. Victoria swallowed. This was her moment, her last chance to regain some control. To steer this towards something she could manage. She straightened her back, pressing her hands against the smooth surface of the table. "I understand that my decision on the flight may have been misinterpreted," she began, keeping her voice even. "I was following service protocols." "Were you?" The voice was not Caldwell's. It was Elijah Carter's. Victoria flinched. His voice was not raised. It was calm, steady, but the weight of it crushed any illusion she had of reclaiming authority. Elijah tilted his head slightly, studying her. "Because I was watching, Miss Langley, and I didn't see protocol." Victoria hesitated, her mind racing. I saw a choice." The words sliced through her defenses. She could feel Caldwell shift slightly beside him, waiting to see what she would do with the accusation. Elijah leaned forward slightly, his hands still folded together. "A mistake is an accident," he said, A mistake is forgetting to bring someone their drink. A mistake is mixing up orders. His gaze sharpened. But what you did wasn't a mistake. Victoria's breath caught. Because he was right. A mistake could be brushed aside. A mistake could be forgiven. A choice meant something more. A choice meant intention. And she had made one. Elijah exhaled, slow and measured. Tell me, Miss Langley, he said, his voice dangerously soft. How many times have you made that choice before? Victoria felt her pulse hammering in her ears. She wanted to deny it. Wanted to insist that she had never treated anyone unfairly. That she had always followed the rules. That she had simply been doing her job. But the truth sat between them. Undeniable. Immovable. Because she had done this before. Not to him. Not to someone who owned the airline. But to others. Passengers who had not spoken up. Who had accepted the slight with quiet resignation. Who had learned that pressing the call button too often would make them a problem. Who had carried the weight of 1,000 unspoken dismissals. The difference was that this time, her choice had consequences. This time, the people she dismissed were watching. Victoria clenched her jaw, gripping the edge of her seat. I didn't intend. You didn't have to, Elijah said. Silence. Long, heavy. Caldwell glanced at Dominic Carter, the head of cabin crew operations, who had been mostly silent. Finally spoke. Miss Langley, he said, his voice clipped. Professional. After reviewing this incident, and considering previous complaints regarding selective service, the executive board has made a decision. Victoria's chest tightened. Dominic closed the folder in front of him. Effective immediately. Your employment with the airline is terminated. Victoria's stomach dropped. Her breath caught in her throat. Sir, please. There is no further discussion. Caldwell interjected. This decision is final. Elijah Carter had not moved. Victoria turned to him, desperation rising in her throat. She had assumed he would demand an apology. That he would want her to say the right words. But he didn't. Because he didn't need her apology. He already knew everything he needed to know. Victoria inhaled sharply, her hands shaking. She wanted to argue, but there was nothing left to say. Miriam Carter's words from the plane came back to her now. Soft and unshaken. I wonder if we hadn't been the owners of the airline, would you have ever given it a second thought? Victoria stood slowly, her legs unsteady beneath her. Her career, her authority, her place in this world she had so carefully constructed had unraveled in a single conversation. Because the truth had always been there. She had just never been forced to see it. The door to the boardroom opened. A security officer was waiting. Victoria swallowed hard, her throat burning, her hands trembling at her sides. She had spent years deciding who belonged. Now, she had been dismissed. And for the first time in her life, she understood what it felt like. Victoria Langley walked out of the executive boardroom and into a world that had already moved on without her. The hallway stretched ahead, polished floors gleaming beneath the artificial glow of overhead lights. The sound of voices echoed faintly from beyond the door's pilots. Flight attendants, corporate staff moving briskly to their destinations, absorbed in the rhythm of a world where she no longer belonged. She had spent years walking these halls with a sense of purpose. Her heels clicking against the tile with the confidence of someone who knew where she was going. Now, those same steps felt hollow, weightless. The security officer trailing her did not touch her, did not push her forward. There was no need. The shame carried her well enough. She had been dismissed, not just from a job, but from the position of silent authority she had once wielded so easily. The quiet, unconscious control she had exercised over who was seen, who was served, who was acknowledged. And now, the world had done the same to her. As she neared the end of the corridor, the terminal came into view, rows of bright screens displaying departure times. Passengers milling about in organized chaos. Then, she saw them, a small group of first-class passengers from the flight. They weren't gathered intentionally, but they lingered near the gate. Their conversations quiet, their glances deliberate. They had seen the security officers waiting at the plane's door. They had seen her escorted off. And now, they were waiting to see what came next. It wasn't loud. There were no gasps, no pointing fingers, no outright condemnation, but there was something worse. Recognition. The woman from 1B, the one who had questioned her policies, met her gaze briefly before shaking her head, turning away. The businessman from 1C barely looked up from his phone, his indifference as damning as anything else. Others glanced at her, murmured amongst themselves, the weight of their judgment settling onto her shoulders like an unbearable weight. And then just beyond them, near the large windows overlooking the runway, she saw him. Elijah Carter stood beside Miriam, his hands tucked casually into his pockets, his posture easy. He was not gloating, he was not reveling in her downfall. But he was watching. And somehow, that was worse. Victoria's breath hitched. She wanted to turn away, to disappear into the crowd, to find some way, any way, to undo the weight of this moment. But there was no escaping it. She had built her career on decisions made in the span of seconds, on instinct, on silent judgments, on the things she had never had to say aloud. And now, in a matter of minutes, it had all unraveled. Elijah didn't speak. He didn't need to. His silence had already done what words never could. Victoria's hands clenched into fists at her sides. She wanted to tell herself that this wasn't fair, that this was an overreaction, that this should have been handled quietly, discreetly. But deep down, she knew the truth. This wasn't about her. It never had been. As she walked past the lingering crowd, her head held stiffly forward, she caught a glimpse of something on one of the travelers' phones. A social media post. A screenshot of the incident from the flight. A few lines of text. Flight attendant refuses to serve black couple in first class, turns out they own the airline. Now she's being escorted out. A few thousand likes already. Comments piling up. Her face wasn't in the image. But it didn't matter. The story had already taken flight. She walked faster. The glass doors leading to the parking lot loomed ahead, marking the final step of her exit. The security officer beside her gestured toward them, signaling that their job was done. No handcuffs, no arrest, just quiet removal. Victoria stopped just before stepping outside, the cold airport air seeping through the cracks. For the first time, she realized how small she felt. For years, she had measured power in the way people responded to her, the way passengers obeyed her authority, the way junior flight attendants avoided questioning her, the way rules bent and twisted depending on who was asking. She had mistaken compliance for respect. Now, she stood alone, stripped of the silent privilege she had carried for so long. She thought of all the times before, how many passengers had pressed the call button, only to be ignored? How many quiet indignities had played out under her watch? Unnoticed, unchallenged? She had dismissed them. And now, she had been dismissed. She exhaled sharply, stepped forward, and let the doors close behind her. Her career, her certainty, her place in the world as she knew it was gone. And for the first time in her life, she truly understood what it meant to be invisible.